Those of you who have studied the life of Shakuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, at least in terms of the mythical rendition of it, have probably heard the story about how when he attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he gained an insight into the real nature of things, but he kind of thought that, boy, this is really tough to understand and to appreciate. This insight is difficult to fathom, and so maybe I should just sit here and continue to meditate and continue to deepen my own involvement in appreciation for the Dharma. But supposedly the gods or other kinds of entities and beings pleaded with him and said, you've got to get up, you've got to go out, you've got to teach. You have a responsibility and an obligation to share this teaching with others. I'm not sure that's exactly how the mythical version goes. You can read it for yourself and characterize it in paraphrased form. But the point is that he did get up, he did go out, he did teach. In fact, of course, the first people he taught, I think, were his 5 colleagues, the ones with whom he had been practicing the ascetic kinds of self-power oriented practices. And of course, they kind of shunned him initially because they realized that he didn't continue with that ascetic kind of sort of starving himself and this kind of thing. He actually took some nourishment and discovered, or at least came to believe in the benefits of a middle path, a path in between self-deprivation and self-indulgence. But in any case, he went and he taught the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path as part of his first teaching. But the side point I want to make is that, we sometimes hear about Mahayana Buddhism being a very different, in many ways, different kind of branch as compared to the Theravada or School of the Elders or Nikaya kind of tradition within Buddhism, which supposedly was closer to the historical Buddhist teachings. But I think what that fails to appreciate is, yes, the conferences or conventions that were held a couple of hundred years after the Buddha, and where his followers put together the various elements of what they could recall of his actual teaching that came out of his mouth, which formulated the Pali Canon, the earlier form of Buddhism. That may have been what came out of his mouth. But what he actually did was, of course, he went around and he helped people with their suffering, and he taught all kinds of people. And so he did that for, I don't know, maybe 45 years. So the point being that he was essentially functioning as a bodhisattva, which is the ideal within Mahayana Buddhism. And that is the role model for people who are wishing to emulate him and to take the path that he took. Of course, us Shin Buddhists feel, and I personally believe, that I'm incapable of doing that. So I'm thankful for the fact that, there is a cosmic Buddha called Amitabha Buddha who made a vow that has resulted in my ability to, through simply entrusting in him and the power of his vow, count on the fact that I'll be reborn in his land of bliss when I die. But that's kind of getting ahead of the story. What I really want to focus on a little bit in this particular video and in these particular musings is the question of, why did the Buddha come into the world? And here we can be referring perhaps to Shakyamuni. Why did he come out of the bliss of his enlightenment, or his meditative state, his contemplative state, his samadhi, if you will? Why did he go out into the world to teach? Or again, if we think of it in more cosmic terms, why do the cosmic Buddhas manifest themselves? If we think of it in terms of the Trikaya doctrine, why does the Dharmakaya manifest itself in the Sambhogakaya and in turn in the Nirmanakaya, the form body? Why does the Buddha come into the world, given the fact that he didn't have to, or she didn't have to, however you want to think about Buddha, whether a male or a female form, because certainly many of the forms are female in terms of characteristics, such as those of Kuan Yin or Guan Yin Bodhisattva, as she was imagined in the Chinese version of that particular sutra and story. But that's a sidebar on a sidebar. Getting back to the question, why did the Buddha come into the world? Why did he appear in this Saha world of suffering? Well, I want to focus on two different aspects of this. One being from the Lotus Sutra, which I keep coming back to over and over, as you know. And in this chapter 2, where he talks about expedient means or tactfulness, this is the methodology that the Buddha uses. He teaches in accordance with what the individuals need to hear as far as their own personalities and level of spiritual development. And in that second chapter, he's very explicit about why he came into the world. Of course, as a little prelude to this, he indicates that the meaning of the laws which the Buddhas expound as opportunity serves is difficult to understand. Wherefore, because I expound the laws by numberless tactful ways and with various reasonings and parabolic expressions, these laws cannot be understood by powers of thought or discrimination. So it's not always a linear kind of, this is the teaching, it's fundamental, it's in stone, this is what you have to learn. The teaching varies as a function of what meanings are necessary for particular beings. And that's a hard concept for us humans to sort of accept, because with our dualistic way of thinking, we want to believe that there's one way, one truth, one way to express the truth, and that's it. But, that's not what the Buddha, that's not the approach that he took. He took a much more nuanced approach, which, as he says, this approach as to how he teaches as opportunity serves is difficult to understand. But he says, again, getting to why the Buddhas come into the world, because the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, only on account of the one very great cause appear in the world. What is that cause? Because the Buddhas, the world-honored ones, desire to cause all living beings to open their eyes to the Buddha knowledge so that they may gain the pure mind. Therefore, they appear in the world. Because they desire to show all living beings the Buddha knowledge, they appear in the world. Because they desire to cause all living beings to apprehend the Buddha knowledge, they appear in the world. Because they desire to cause all living beings to enter the way of the Buddha knowledge, they appear in the world. So they really want to expose us to Buddha knowledge. They want us to become Buddhas. That's the whole teaching within the Lotus Sutra, is that when we talk about it being a one Buddha vehicle or a one vehicle teaching, that's what it means, is that the one teaching, the one vehicle, is the Buddha vehicle. And even the Shravakas and the Pratyeka Buddhas, ultimately the expectation is, from within the standpoint of universal salvation within the Lotus Sutra, is that the path for all is that they will become Buddhas. In fact, Zipporn has a rather a novel interpretation, if I can recall how it goes, is that even though that it's unbeknownst to them, the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are actually, based on vows that they made in a previous life, they're bodhisattvas that only appear in the form of, I'll call it Shravakas, I think is the right pronunciation, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, in order to teach beings who are not quite yet ready to believe that the ultimate objective of all beings is to become a Buddha. Of course, part of the problem, as I alluded to earlier, which we Shin Buddhists are well aware of in terms of our own reflections upon our own limited capacities, our own acute awareness of the fact that we're filled with blind passions, that the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance dwell within us to depths that cannot be overcome, even having been exposed to the profound teachings of the Mahayana. That then the question becomes, well, would the Buddha come into the world merely to express teachings that were available to those of higher capacity? We know that's not true. We know in the parable of the herbs in the Lotus Sutra that the rain comes down, the rain of the teaching comes down and waters all the plants, trees, and flowers in accordance with their capacities. So in terms of what the capacity is of the 99.9% of us, how can we frame this question or reframe it from a Shin Buddha standpoint as far as what's the reason the Buddha appears in the world? And Shinran, in his collected works, is what I'm reading from, which is a wonderful 2-volume set for, I think, like $50 American. You can purchase new, and I would certainly highly recommend it for anybody that has an interest in Jodo Shinshu or Shin Buddhism. That here on page 485, within Shinran's writing called Notes on Once Calling and Many Calling, and again, Shinran was very prolific. He wrote a lot of stuff. And there are little volumes that have different aspects of his writings, but this one volume has all the writings, and I believe the other volume, volume 2, gives more interpretations of the writings. But I have this tendency to go off on tangents, and I'll come back to my main point, which is that how can those of us who are more limited in our capacity understand and relate to this very important question of why did the Buddha come into the world? Well, here, what Shinran does, and he often does this, he quotes from other sources. He's quoting from the Larger Sutra, the Larger Sukhavati or Pure Land Sutra, which according to Shinran is the, quote, true teaching. And this is the sutra or scripture within which Dharmakara made his 48 vows. But in that Larger Sutra, he says Sakyamuni stated as follows, Sakyamuni being the historical Buddha. Now we know that by the time that Sukhavati Sutra was written, it was way past Sakyamuni's lifetime, but that's another story that the historians can dwell upon. But from a spiritual standpoint, we're thinking of this as having come from Shakyamuni, who was the first Buddha who really was the founder of our religion. So here in the Larger Sutra it says, the reason the Tathagatas, and Tathagatas of course means the Buddhas, one who thus comes or one who thus gone to the other shore. The reason the Tathagatas appear in the world, here it is, drum roll. The reason the Tathagatas appear in the world is their desire to save the multitudes of beings and by blessing them with the true and real benefit. So we know this to be true. I mean, why did the Buddha come into the world? He came to help us reduce our degree of suffering. Why did Shakyamuni, Buddha, Gautama, the Buddha, why did the prince leave the compound? Why did he leave? What happened? What happened to his consciousness when he got exposed to a person who was ill, a person who was old, a person who was dead? Well, he saw that there was suffering in the world, unlike what he was exposed to by his father, the king. And that's why what was his goal when he left and when he took up the life of an ascetic? His goal was to find a solution to the problem of suffering. And that really is at base the essence of the reason, the tour, what is that word in French? The reason, the basic reason for the existence of Buddhism and the founding of Buddhism is to come up with a solution to the problem of suffering. So it makes sense that the Buddha would appear in the world in order to help us reduce our suffering. So again, the real reason that the Tathagatas appear in the world is their desire to save the multitudes of beings, which is all of us sentient beings, and by blessing them, by blessing us, with the true and real benefit. So then the question, what is the true and real benefit? Well, here we have the bottom line. As you might have guessed by now, if you've had any exposure to Shin Buddhism, is the true and real benefit is Amida's vow. And I'm not going to go through again in this particular rambling musings to reiterate what the origin of the vow was and how the dynamics are as to how it works, because that can be covered in other kinds of videos or readings. But most of you who are listening to this video know quite well what the nature is of Amida's vow and what that promise is to us, that we will be reborn in the land of bliss by simply entrusting in that vow. The power of that vow. The true and real benefit that he wants to bless us with is Amida's vow. Thus, the reason that the Buddhas appear in the world age after age is that they desire to bless and save all sentient beings by teaching them the power of Amida's vow. Since they take this as their fundamental intent, the vow is called the true and real benefit. Further, it is termed the direct teaching for which all Buddhas appear in the world. So that's why Buddhas appear in the world, according to Shin Buddhism, in order to expose us to the promise of the power of the vow. And of course, just to close off with another sidebar, is that there's reference in there in the plural to multiple Tathagatas, because again, within the cosmology of Mahayana Buddhism, there are myriad Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and various Buddha fields or Buddha lands. And over the course of time, one Buddha after another is born in the world, even in our world, to communicate this teaching to us. Shakyamuni, of course, was the historical Buddha from within our age over the past few hundred years, couple 3,000 years. And the next one supposedly will be Maitreya, or Maitreya Buddha, the Buddha of the future, who right now supposedly is in Tushita heaven, awaiting his rebirth in our land. And so when Maitreya Buddha comes into this Saha world, he'll be doing a variety of teachings. He will teach the more self-power-oriented practices to those who are capable of it. He will teach precepts. He will teach meditation. He will teach prajna, wisdom. He will teach all of those things, the 6 paramitas, the Eightfold Path. But for most of us, what he's going to need to teach is something a lot more basic. He's going to teach us about that Buddha in the western part of the universe called Amitabha, or Buddha of infinite light, or Amitayus, Buddha of infinite life, who is there infinitely in that Buddha land, prepared to accept us when we die, and then for us to be able to become Buddhas, which, as I said at the beginning of this musings, that's the goal of all Buddhists, is to become a Buddha. So I myself expect one day to become a Buddha, and at that time my name will be Daigyo, great practice. Great practice that I cannot practice now. And I'll do another musing sometime on that point, which is that within Shin Buddhism, we really don't have any actual practices. Well, how can I end except by saying, Namandabs, Namandabs, Namandabs.